In this demonstration, we're going to practice creating volumes on hard disk drives in a Windows system. One of the tools you can use to do this is the Disk Management utility. To launch Disk Management, I'll come down and right-click on Start. I could start the Disk Management utility by selecting Computer Management and then selecting Disk Management from there. But since Disk Management is also on this menu, I'll use that instead. A window opens and I have the option to initialize Disk 3. We'll cover this in a moment. For now, we can close this dialog. Let's maximize this window and bring this bottom pane up a bit so we can see all of our disks. We have 4 disks installed on the system: Disk 0, 1, 2, and 3. Disk 0 is our primary hard drive where our Windows OS has been installed. Notice that it has its own partitions. We have our main C drive, which contains all of our boot configurations and Windows systems. We have a recovery partition, which can be used to recover our Windows partition if something goes wrong. This disk also has this small EFI partition that's used when the disk has been configured to use the GPT partition style. Disks 1 through 3 are completely empty. I can define whatever partitioning style I want on these 3 disks. Now, before you start partitioning volumes on a Windows system, you have to make 2 important decisions. The first decision is which partitioning style you're going to use. One option is to use the Master Boot Record, or MBR. The other option is to use a GUID partition table, or GPT partition. For us, Disk 1 and Disk 2 have already been initialized as MBR partitioning styles. You can tell because if you right-click, you see an option to convert to GPT. Disk 3 hasn't been initialized yet, but we'll get to that in a moment. Since we chose to use MBR, the disk is subject to the limitations of the Master Boot Record partitioning style. For example, I can only have up to 4 primary partitions on either of the disks. Let's see how that works. I'm going to create several new partitions on Disk 1. To do that, I'll right-click on Disk 1 and select New Simple Volume. We're going to make this about 6 gigabytes in size. That's 6144 megabytes. Click Next. We're going to assign the drive letter D. Click Next. We're going to label this volume Art. We'll leave Perform a Quick Format marked to make things a little bit quicker. Click Next and finish. Now we have a 6 gigabyte NTFS partition on our hard drive. Because this is a data partition with no operating system installed, its only notable attribute is that it's a primary partition. Now let's go back and create another 6 gigabyte partition on Disk 1. I'll right-click on the unallocated space, select New Simple Volume, and then click Next. I'll enter 6144 for the disk size to make it 6 gigabytes and assign drive letter E. We'll name this one Data. We're going to perform a quick format again. Click Finish. Let's create another 6 gigabyte file partition on the drive. It's the same process. New Simple Volume, click Next, enter 6144 megabytes to equal 6 gigabytes, click Next. We'll assign the partition letter F and label it Finance. Click Next and finish. And now we have the third partition. Okay, let's create the last volume for this drive. New Simple Volume, click Next, enter 6144 megabytes, click Next. We'll assign it a partition letter of G. Next, we'll name it Stats. Click Next and finish, and now we have our Stats volume. Notice that something significant happened. On the left of this disk, you can see that we have 3 primary partitions. But when we created the 4th partition, Disk Management automatically created an extended partition, and then it created a logical partition for the Stats volume. Because we're dealing with a basic disk, we're still constrained by all of the partitioning rules that apply when you use the MBR partitioning. You're only allowed a total of 4 partitions on a basic disk. What we have here are 3 primary partitions and 1 extended partition. Within that extended partition, we have logical partitions where we can create additional volumes. This is designed to get us around the 4 partition limit. Notice that we still have free unallocated space within the extended partition, and we can create more volumes within that space. For example, we can create yet another 6 GB volume within the extended partition. We'll go ahead and do that. New simple volume, click Next, 6144, a drive letter of H, and a volume label of Research. Click Next and then Finish. As you can see, using an extended partition allows us to get around that 4-partition limit. I can keep creating volumes as long as I have free space available within the extended partition. When we started this demonstration, I pointed out that disks 1 and 2 had already been configured as basic disks. There may be times when it might work best if one or both of these disks were dynamic disks. To make that change, right-click the desired disk, then select Convert to Dynamic Disk. I'm prompted to specify which disks to convert. Since I only want to convert disk 2, I'll click OK. Now, disk 2 is a dynamic disk. I could have converted disk 0 and disk 1 to dynamic disks as well, but it's important to remember that a computer can't boot its operating system from a dynamic disk, so I would probably never convert drive 0. When working with dynamic disks, you can create volumes the same way you create them on a basic disk. I'll right-click the unallocated space and select New Simple Volume. Let's make this volume about 10 gigabytes in size, which is 10,240 megabytes. Click Next. I'll assign the drive letter of I. Click Next, and I'll label this volume Development. Click Next and Finish. If you already have a basic disk with defined volumes, you can convert it into a dynamic disk as well. Let's go ahead and do that. This time, we're going to convert disk 1. I'll right-click, select Convert to Dynamic Disk, and then click OK. It shows us a verification of which disks it'll convert. Notice that we get a message stating that we won't be able to boot from any of the partitions on this disk, as only a basic disk is able to do that. Since we don't have any operating systems installed on this disk, I'll click Yes. Notice that something significant happened when I did that. The extended partition went away. That's because with dynamic disks, you can have more than 4 partitions on a given disk. As you can see, we now have 5 volumes on this disk. This is kind of nice. With dynamic disks, you don't need to deal with the concepts of primary, extended, and logical volumes anymore. It's much more plain and simple. Everything is just a volume. There are a few other partitioning options that I want to show you, but to do that, I need to create some space on disk 1. I'll right-click and then select Delete Volume. Click OK. Now I'll do the same with the Stats volume and the same for the Finance volume. Once that's done, I have about 920 gigabytes of unallocated space on disk 1 and about 922 gigabytes of unallocated space on disk 2. Now, when I go back to disk 1 and right-click, I can create other types of volumes besides simple volumes. I could create a spanned volume. By creating a spanned volume, you can incorporate space from 2 or more hard disk drives in the system. In other words, you can create one very large volume that spans across multiple disks. Let's go ahead and select New Spanned Volume. Click Next. This brings us to the Select Disks window. By default, the drive I started with is already in the selected pane, and I can specify which disks I want to include in my new spanned volume. Let's go ahead and select the 922 gigabytes of unallocated space on disk 2. Click Add and then Next. And I'll assign it the drive letter F. We use NTFS for a file system, and we'll give this volume the label of Stats. To save time, I'll select Perform a Quick Format and then click Next and Finish. As you can see, about 920 gigabytes of our spanned volume resides on disk 1, with the remaining 922 gigabytes residing on disk 2. This means that if I were to create a file and save it to my F drive on the Stats volume, it could end up on disk 1, or it might end up on disk 2. In fact, if the disk space for this volume were heavily allocated, it's possible that some of the file could end up on disk 1 and the rest of the file would go to disk 2. So far, I've shown you how to convert a basic disk to a dynamic disk, but we can also go the other direction. Notice that when I right-click on disk 1, you see that there's an option to convert the disk back to a basic disk, but that option is grayed out. The same is true for disk 2. That's because we have volumes defined on both disks. If I want to convert these disks back to BASIC, I have to delete all of the volumes currently on those disks. Let's go ahead and do that. I'll start by right-clicking on the Stats volume and then selecting Delete Volume. Click Yes. Next, I'll delete the Data volume and then the Art volume. I can delete these volumes casually because I just created them, and I know that there's no data on them. But the prompt given for each volume I delete specifically warns me that if I delete this volume, all of the data on it will be lost. That could cause big problems. Make sure to back up data that you want to preserve before you delete a volume. Also notice that when I deleted these volumes, they automatically converted back to BASIC disks. All right, there's one other thing we need to talk about before we end this demo: the difference between MBR and GPT disks. MBR has been around for a very long time. It has a lot of limitations that we've already talked about. Using a dynamic disk is one way to get around those limitations. Another option for getting around the MBR limitations is to use a GPT disk instead. With the GPT partitioning style, all the limitations we associate with MBR are gone. In other words, you don't have to worry about primary, extended, and logical partitions when your disks have been initialized using the GPT partitioning style. All the partitions are just partitions. The one limitation you do have is that you can only create 128 GPT partitions per disk. To create a GPT disk, I'll right-click on Disk 3 and then select Initialize Disk. With Disk 3 selected, all I need to do is use the default option of GPT and select OK. With that done, I can come down here and create volumes just like I did on the MBR disks. I'll just create a quick partition, label it D, and call this one Data. Now that we've created it, when I open File Explorer, you can see that the data drive is ready for use. And that's it for our demo on volumes and disk management. In this demo, we talked about how to manage disk partitions and volumes in Windows using disk management. We discussed how to create simple volumes. We reviewed the differences between BASIC and dynamic disks, and we also discussed the differences between MBR and GPT partitions.